So, hello. I've never had a guest on twice before, but Ian, you've been very excited to come on again, so welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. It's nice to be back.
So, you wanted to talk about your interest in history and how it's relevant on what's happening in the world today.
Yeah, yeah.
So, what is it that worries you the most?
That's a good question. What is it that worries me the most? Well, probably I'm a natural worrier, but I am one of these people who's got a sort of insatiable curiosity about why things are the way they are and what direction things might go in, how things work under the surface and that type of thing. And that curiosity ranges from everything from historical events through to machines and technology, so and everything in between. So yeah, I think one of the things I was keen to talk about today is there's a lot of things going on in the world that absorb a lot of people's attention, rightly, because there's a lot of important things that impact upon people's lives. What I'm really interested in doing is digging into what's going on underneath the surface and trying to find out the reasons why some of the things that are going on are actually happening. And then further than that, I'm trying to work out how things might turn out in the future. Because one of the aspects of study of history is it allows us to look for patterns and see potential precedents for the way things are potentially going to turn out. Whether I do that consciously or not, part of it's unconscious actually, but I'm always looking at parallels and patterns. And I think the danger for somebody like me is to maybe create patterns that aren't necessarily there. I think that's the humans are programmed, well, from a sort of evolutionary point of view, to recognise patterns to the extent that sometimes they'll create patterns that aren't necessarily there, and I'm sometimes guilty of that. But I think overall, if collectively, if we don't have an understanding of history and what's happened in the past, then we've got no way of making sense of what's going on today in the world. That's my view.
The thing that worries me about that is that history's being erased and rewritten
Mm,
by trans rights activists. They're saying that any sort of woman who was gender non-conforming or pretended to be a man in order to get what they wanted to do, like for example, if they pretend to be a man so they could go to war,
yeah.
they were transgender, which is just
Yes.
a
Yes.
big leap, isn't it?
I've seen, yes, I've seen. Well, history is no different to any other academic discipline, and we've seen in recent years that all areas of academic endeavour have been tainted or corrupted potentially by some of the stuff that you're talking about. And yeah, the example that you just used with the transgender ideology, you can see that you have the amount of recent articles I've read, ludicrous articles that have purported to be the views of authoritative experts and so forth on things that are patently absurd, like you've just said. I don't know, Julius Caesar was a trans woman or something, you know. But I just made that one up. I can't bring any to mind, but I've seen so many of those articles purporting to be sort of rational, academically researched views, which are patently absurd.
I think it's Joan of Arc and
Joan of Arc,
Boudica,
right there. There's been lots.
maybe.
There's been lots.
Yeah.
That yeah, I'm sure I haven't heard that one, but I don't doubt it. But there has been lots along those lines. Similarly, the stuff that's being horrified by the stuff that's apparently being taught in schools about that sort of stuff and about other nonsense like black people built Stonehenge and all this nonsense. And that's being seriously propounded. That's terrifying. So, yes, I think there is a very sinister attempt to try and reshape history, and it's corrupting the past, as it were.
So one of the things that you draw parallels with a lot is the fall of the Roman Empire.
Oh yeah, I'm always going on about the fall of the Roman Empire because, yeah, it's a subject that's fascinated me for years. Ever since when I was a lot younger, I read Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, and it took me a long time to read it, but I think I was in my early 20s, but I did read it. And the subject has fascinated me ever since. And I think there's a lot of, we have to be mindful that the world is a very different place now to what it was in late antiquity. But I think there are parallels, definitely, and you can't help but notice some similarities in well, too many things to talk about. I could talk for hours about all the different examples of parallels that I've seen.
Can you give some examples? Because I think that would be helpful for
Yeah,
people
yeah.
who don't know the history of the fall of the Roman Empire.
Definitely, definitely. I think one of the key aspects that's probably not particularly well known is connected with the debasement of the currency and its role in weakening Roman power. Um, the essentially currency debasement is something which has gone on. Well, it's gone on for a long time. Yeah, because some stage in the history, the Roman currency was debased. Metals were introduced into the silver denarius, and so it became less pure. Obviously, people aren't silly; they realise that, and so the currency became worth less. I sort of draw a parallel between that and some of the enormous amount of essentially money printing that's been carried out by governments and central banks in recent years, which is having the same effect. It's weakening. It's eroding the value of currency. It's weakening confidence in our financial systems, and ultimately, it's storing up, I would say, potentially catastrophic problems, which are sooner or later going to, I think anyway, sooner or later going to hit us very, very hard. That's one example. I mean,
Yeah.
another
The other
example.
example is the degenerate behaviour that was seen in society, like all those men protesting the Supreme Court judgment with the moobs out and having, what did they call it? Was they had even a hashtag with the PISS word in it. I'm not going to
All
say.
right, right. Yeah, yeah,
So they
that's,
were doing that all over statues, women's rights statues
yeah, yeah,
in London.
yeah, that's a good example. The increasing signs of what somebody, a historian, old-fashioned historian like Gibbon would have called degeneracy, which I think is a good word. It's a good word to describe what you're talking about, actually, in my opinion. Yeah, the increasing signs of degeneracy that pervade Western societies, and it's everything from the sort of things that you're talking about to the laziness of populations, or the development of a super privileged elitist sort of class that is interested only in its own aggrandizement and pleasure. And we can see those things today. The Million Mood March that you've described is an example of the sort of thing that yes, you're right, would have outraged people in the past as immoral behaviour.
It was a turf in London who named it that.
Yeah, I like the term, it's quite funny.
You get quite upset about how people dress in the summer as well, though, don't you?
Yeah,
Just
but
like simple things like that.
I do, yeah, I do. Yes, I like people to sort of to take some sort of pride and self-respect in their appearance and their behaviour and that type of thing, which are increasingly seen as out-of-date values. And that's why I say we're not living in a degenerate age of great decadence. Which, yeah, I cannot help as a historian, I cannot help but being
Flamboyantly
reminded of.
dressed man.
Yeah, well, yes, but nevertheless, I wouldn't like to be a slob sort of thing. So yeah, I cannot help but see parallels like that. I think in other more subtle parallels include the increasing. I'm very interested in the way things are presented. We live in a really media saturated sort of age, and I'm really interested in not so much the content of what is said and what's presented, but how it's presented. And I think I can see a lot of parallels between that and periods in history where the same techniques have been used. So, for example, the art of, we were talking about the Roman Empire, the late antiquity, the use of art, civic art, in the later Roman Empire to elevate the imperial persona to a more sort of removed, sort of divine status that's somehow above humanity, and the increasing emphasis on what could you say, on ritual, and often quite, from a pragmatic sense, often quite pointless ritual above pragmatism. And I see things like I don't know, summit meetings between European Union leaders or NATO or the G7. Often they don't actually achieve anything in practice. What they're much more about is about symbolism and about ritual. So they're doing something in order to convey a message and to display something and to signal something. And I suppose the thing that you will be well aware of in the corporate world, as similar things have gone on, although thankfully it seems to be in retreat a bit, is the virtue signalling. It has a similar quality about it that reminds me of a sort of Dark Ages prostrating themselves before a bishop or something. It has a sort of a weird performative element to it that doesn't have any pragmatic function, but is the idea that the display and signal is much more important than anything real or concrete.
Yeah, it's about what you look like rather than what you do.
Yes, it's about the message that it conveys.
Interestingly, on LinkedIn, that's what the activists have started talking about. The fact that it is virtue signalling, and they want more concrete action rather than people just changing their logo and flying rainbows everywhere.
Yeah, that is interesting, and I think that's that probably demonstrates the ludicrously unrealistic ideas and mindset of some of the people you're talking about, because they're not going to get that.
No,
In my opinion.
one of them even said, one of the posts even said about spending money on certain things, and I'm like, well, what else do you want a company to do? Like, I don't want them to do any of that, actually, but what do they think else is going to happen? I don't understand. They don't specify what it is that they actually want. They're just criticising the virtue signal and the emptiness of the things that they are doing. But actually, businesses are there to make widgets. Do you know what I mean?
Well, ultimately, businesses are there to make a profit, and
Yeah.
that's a good thing.
It's about productivity and profitability and efficiency and things like that. And yet they're focusing on changing their logos and telling everyone how wonderful they are, and all this B Corp stuff, like, oh, we're so green. And
Yeah, you could, if it's taken to its logical conclusion, it's ultimately sort of like communism, essentially. It's denying the worth and the value in itself of healthy, profitable commercial activity, if you like, which is essentially a quasi-communist mentality, isn't it? If you think companies are there, if you think businesses are there primarily to look after or tick boxes or meet quotas about diversity or reducing CO2 or something, then you don't understand the fundamental mechanics of capitalism, and you deny the worth of our society, the capitalist roots of our society, which, as I say, essentially is a sort of communism, isn't it? And that's
yeah,
my way of looking at it.
I was interested when you were talking, I think it was a few years ago, about the benefits of capitalism and the reason why it's better than any other way of running a society.
Yeah, well, it's better than anything that anybody's come up with so far, anyway.
But we
It seems
hear
to be.
criticism a lot, and so it would be good for you to talk a bit about that.
Oh, okay. Yeah, well, I suppose you just have to look at the track record of, I don't know, I guess you could look at the world since the Industrial Revolution, and for anybody who says that that sort of thing's is a bad thing, you only have to look at stuff like infant mortality, longevity, um, the amount of hours of leisure time that the average person has. I don't know, you could use any of those metrics and see that they've increased a lot since the Industrial Revolution. I'm massively generalising here, by the way. But yeah, I'm making a general point that it's to technological breakthroughs and a free market, well, relatively free market, are overall beneficial things in terms of the lives of most people. As I say, I'm massively generalising here. I don't want people to be saying, "Oh, well, yes, but what about how many holidays did a medieval peasant have in France?" Yeah, I get that.
Well, but I don't understand. Can you explain the context of that?
Well, I've just made a general comment about about capitalism and industrialisation making people's lives better.
How many holidays would a medieval peasant have had?
Well,
I
more
don't
than a
know.
lot of people think, because you just have to think about it, I suppose. I'm not an expert in any of these things, by the way. But yeah, I was thinking about that recently, and I was thinking about the influence of the Christian church, and thinking about how many holy days, holidays, where they wouldn't have done any work. I can't remember the exact figure, but it was a lot. So the average medieval peasant would have not done a lot of work on some days. So maybe it wasn't as horrific as I first thought, anyway. In terms of the life of your average peasant, I'm not saying it was pleasant, but yeah, if you compare that to a mill worker in the northwest of England in the early 19th century, say, I don't know, you could say maybe the medieval peasant had more time off or something. As I say, I'm not an expert in these
Yeah,
things.
I think probably the thing that stood out for me was the fact that um people from for want of a better way of putting it, like a working class background, are able to be better off because of capitalism.
Yeah. So it's effectively enabled social mobility, you might say. Yes, I think without capitalism, you don't have any social mobility. Again, that's a massively generalised thing to say. I suppose you could look at I don't know. You could look at the life of somebody like Stalin. And see, you could argue, well, benefited from a lot of social mobility because he started out as a sort of petty criminal, and he ended up as the dictator of the Soviet Union, the leader. So somebody could say, oh well, he experienced a lot, and that wasn't capitalism. So that's fair enough. But yeah, generally, I think for most people, capitalism enables opportunities for ordinary people to be able to improve their situations, advance themselves, and improve the prospects of their families more than any other type of economic arrangement. Is there anything else in terms of what specific things do you want me to talk about? Do you want me to
I don't
talk
know.
about immigration and war and instability?
Yeah, immigration is quite a hot topic at the minute, isn't it? So, yeah. How do you see that, the impact of mass uncontrolled immigration, like they're breaching our borders, aren't they, on a daily
Yeah,
basis, and they have been for a long time.
it's another. It's yeah, as you say, it's a massively hot topic at the minute throughout the Western world, really, and I'm really fascinated in the desperate efforts of our establishment to downplay the catastrophic impact that it's having in a lot of ways. And I would argue it is having a catastrophic impact in lots of different ways, economically, societally, from a security point of view, from a crime point of view, from the safety of women, particularly women and children, the uncontrolled migration of people from all over the world into Western societies, high tolerance, high trust Western societies is having a catastrophic impact on the safety of women and children as one topic. Um, so yeah, again, there are historical parallels. You only have to look at the lessons of history to see when population movements have taken place on large scales, it's usually led to instability, war, and chaos. Like I say, I'm making a big general comment there. You could pick out some examples, and there's plenty. Again, you could look at what happened to the Roman Empire via migration. You could look at the Mongol invasion of practically everywhere on the Eurasian continent.
Can you say a bit more about the Roman Empire? Didn't they like move around themselves?
Didn't who move around themselves?
The Romans?
They roamed all over the place.
Don't laugh at me.
No, I like that. It did move around. They created, yeah. Well,
I'm
yes.
gonna ask you stupid questions, okay?
No, I like that. I like that. So you want me to talk a bit about? Right. Okay. Yeah. Well, the Roman Empire from about the what? I mean, the empire always had defined boundaries, and I think the complexity came from the empire's relationship with the barbarians beyond the defined boundaries. Because saying there was a defined boundary doesn't mean like there was like Hadrian's Wall. There was a big wall on one side. It was Rome. On the other side, it was like nothing. It was wilderness. It was, it wasn't like that. The boundaries were porous. There was lots of trade. There was lots of social interaction. There was lots of contact between the empire and the societies outside of the empire, on the borders of the empire. And to a certain extent, you could argue that was one of the things that ultimately encouraged mass migration into imperial territory, because the wealth of the empire did flow out and interact with those societies and influence and change the societies that were on the borders of the empire. So if you look at say the Rhine frontier, you could see that round about the 3rd century AD, there was massive changes in those societies that were living on the other side of the Rhine frontier to Rome, and those changes were being driven, or you could say were being driven by the interaction of those societies with Rome, the wealth, the amount of gold that flowed into those societies, and they created sort of proto-nations, which in turn were becoming increasingly pressurized by migrants from further east.
What's a proto-nation?
What's a proto-nation? It's before you have a nation state, before the idea of a nation state, where you've got a nation and a government and a king and a constitution and those types of things. You might have a confederation of tribes that were becoming increasingly bound together and increasingly sharing a collective identity. So if you look at Germans, the Roman term of Germans encompasses a whole lot of different tribes. There wasn't a nation of Germans over the Rhine, but increasingly those tribes were becoming more closely interlinked, and they were sharing common values, common trading systems. They were even in some cases they were choosing their own kings that were a collective king over several tribes. So you can see how the nation state didn't just appear overnight, but some of these tribes coalesced into proto-nations, is the term I used. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah,
So
kind of.
when they came under pressure from migrants from further east, then they in turn started to make incursions onto imperial territory. You were talking about huge groupings, population groupings. You were talking about hundreds of thousands of people. Whereas before you might have a raid or an incursion by an individual tribe. It wasn't really something that the imperial authorities needed to worry about too much. But when you're talking about huge numbers of people, whole nations, if you like, coming onto imperial territory and then carving out areas for themselves on imperial territory, then the empire started to have a real problem. That's the way I see it anyway.
So it kind of reminds me of how England used to be, or the UK, however you want to define it. Like our part of our identity, if you like, for want of a better way of putting it, was to welcome other cultures in. Like, we had all the like Chinese takeaways and the Indian restaurants and stuff like that, and that was part of our culture, wasn't it?
Yeah, definitely. You could look at fish and chip shops and
Where
Italians
were
and
they
railways
Italian?
and
Yeah.
yeah, people from Eastern Europe, Jewish people, Russian people. But I think the difference is these things. Again, this is an opinion. These positive things, the positive things that those people have brought to our society, to British culture, if you like, they happened when we had people coming to this country who wanted to be British and they wanted to be part of our civilization. I think that's the difference. What you've had for the past 30, 40 years, maybe longer, I don't know, is this idea of what's termed multiculturalism, which I think that has enabled people to come to this country, but not to assimilate, not to learn to get on with others, but to actually carve out, in the same way that I described in a literal sense those barbarian invasions of Rome, you're having the same sort of thing. So you're having sort of ethnic enclaves and societies within societies that are just carving out little niches for themselves that don't really have any allegiance to the wider society. And so I think the term that you could use the term balkanization. So you could have a whole collection of different ethnic and tribal groupings within, say, Britain, that don't have any common cause, if you like. And I think it's potentially a very divisive and destabilising thing for society. And that's something that, as I say, the authorities seem desperate to try and suppress any ideas like that.
This is the thing though, like I'm thinking back to when I started working in Ashington. So that was about 2006. I remember that was shared. I've worked in the YMCA in Ashington, and I remember we shared a building with other organisations, and they were providing like English and sort of, there was that test for people who were coming in to about British culture, and they were asked questions. And I remember at the time thinking, oh, well, I don't know the answer to some of those questions. So there was an attempt back then. I remember it being quite widespread at the time that you had to pass like a test to get British citizenship or whatever it was. They
Right.
had hurdles like that. They had like an attempt to integrate people into the
Mm.
society and to have that, but now they've seemed to have abandoned that, and now you're racist if you talk about this sort of thing.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm not a racist. I think the people who tend to throw the people who indulge in that name calling, they actually are racists. But anyway,
Yeah,
that's
can you say more about that? I think you should.
well, what is there to say? Defining racism is a relatively easy thing to do, and all you have to do is look at the definition of something. So what's a racist? Get someone to define what a racist is, see what they say, and then say, well, okay, measure yourself against that.
But it's the kind of things that they say, like this intersectionality. They've got some very fixed ideas where we should sort of give privileges to black people, for example, because they say that like at a disadvantage to us, but that's quite patronizing, and that in itself is racist. Is that the kind of thing you mean?
Yes, yeah, exactly. That's a really good example. Yeah, of course it's racist. To me, racism is categorizing somebody by an immutable ethnic quality that person has, rather than categorizing them on more objective and meritocratic measures. So,
Yeah,
in other
based on their
words,
behavior and their values and their
yes, yes,
yeah.
and
And as well, of course, the term racist is used interchangeably when they're talking about religion as well.
that's true as well. Yeah, which is another thing that annoys me.
Like Islamophobia, what the hell's that?
Well, well, if you look at the word, what is it? I
Being
would I would
frightened of Islam.
I would see it, but it's an irrational fear of Islam. That's what Islamophobia means.
It's not irrational though, is it? If
Well,
you've got a fear of Islam,
what's an
it is,
irrational fear? You can have an
well, that's what I'm
irrational
saying.
yeah, you can have an irrational fear of spiders.
That is irrational, but if they're not ones that bite. It's
Exactly.
not that irrational if you're in, say, Australia and there's
Yes.
deadly spiders,
I was just
but
going
in
to
the
say.
UK it's irrational.
Exactly, exactly. If you live somewhere where there's those what they're called tunnel web spiders or something, whatever their name is. Forgive me, I don't know a lot about spiders. Then it's not irrational to be scared of them because they're very very dangerous. But
Well,
in
all
England,
spiders are called Oscar, aren't they?
yes, in England to be scared of spiders is quite irrational.
But it comes from evolution, so it does make sense if you put it in that sense.
Yeah, I suppose.
Like if you put it in that context, it makes sense that you would be scared of spiders because some of them are deadly.
I hadn't thought of that. Yeah, that's a good point.
So we've evolved to be scared of them.
Yeah. So from an evolutionary point of view, it makes sense.
But in terms of Islam, what do they do
Well,
as part of that religion?
what do you mean?
Well, what is it that you might be irrationally frightened of?
Well, I don't. You say the fears that a lot of people express aren't irrational.
Well, that's
It's
what I'm
not
saying.
irrational.
What fears do people have?
Well, you tell me. I mean, you're
I think it's probably of getting their head chopped off for saying something against the Prophet Muhammad or
or being, being having your children sexually molested or abducted or stuff like that. Those things aren't irrational fears, are they?
because that's in the Quran, like the married children.
Well, yes, they did. Yes. Um, Famously, Muhammad married his wife at she was aged 12, I think it was.
Is it not 9?
I can't remember.
I
No,
think
I
it
think
might
he
have
met
been
her
9. All
he
right.
didn't marry her until she was 12 or something. Forgive me if I've got that wrong, but it was something like that. But yeah, well, actually, interestingly, on that subject, Pakistan has just made child marriage illegal, and there are clerics, Muslim clerics in Pakistan, that are up in arms about that, saying it's un-Islamic. So
My
yes,
goodness. Well,
so
it's good that they made it illegal.
yeah, I think so. Yeah, as I say, I haven't read much
I
about it,
wonder
but
what's led to them doing that, though. There must be some sort of pressure from somewhere.
no idea. Who knows? International pressure. I've got no idea.
But yeah, there is like a fear of, the type of violence that you hear about from that kind of community. Like they get very violent if you upset them about religion and if you don't convert, and particularly how they treat women.
Yeah, yeah. So these fears aren't irrational at all, are they? They're perfectly reasonable apprehensions.
It's just propaganda, though, isn't it? They use these terms to try and shut you up, to stop you from talking about the things that you've actually got genuine concerns about. And the result of that is that if you don't give someone a voice and you ignore them, then eventually it's like a pressure cooker, isn't it? And it's going to erupt. And
Yeah,
that's what I'm kind of concerned about.
yeah. Because ultimately, everybody loses if that happens. And yeah, I think we are headed for that. And I'm not the only person who's saying that at the minute. I think in Britain, we have exactly that situation. Legitimate concerns are being suppressed by the authorities and the establishment. And
I
yes,
think that's why it's important for everybody to talk about it.
definitely,
And
definitely,
keep talking. We need to talk more, not less.
yeah. And the problem is the establishment is trying to silence honest and open discussion, and that, as you say, ultimately that will lead to very bad things that nobody wants. But they don't seem to have the ability to work that out. They don't seem to, if they do, they don't care. I'm not sure which.
I'm not sure that they have the ability to work it out. I
Yeah.
don't think they realise how strongly people feel. And I think they've had a big shock with Reform winning
Well,
the elections.
yeah, I suppose it depends who you mean by they, because I've based my opinions on looking at on a mixture of, like I was talking about, thinking about historical parallels and what have you, but also on looking at statistical data and information that I can gather. So that information and the historical context and the statistical data, it's not just privileged to me. Other people have access to it. The they that you're talking about has access to it. Everybody
The thing
does.
is, though, it's the way that those statistics and data are, what conclusions are drawn from those statistics.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, I saw some. I saw something the other day where the stuff about these rape gangs. Can I say that on this channel? The Muslim rape gangs, the Pakistani Muslim rape gangs, was being completely misrepresented by a senior policewoman because she presented correct statistical information, but she didn't contextualize that information. So she said quite correctly that where the ethnicity of the offender was recorded, the bulk of those crimes, those types of crimes, were being committed by people whose ethnicity was self-identified as white British men. And that's absolutely correct. But what she omitted to say was that how representative were they of the wider population. And in fact, as soon as you look at that, you see that Pakistani men are unbelievably overrepresented in that offender category, and white British men are extremely underrepresented in proportion to their share of the overall population. Does that
Yeah,
make sense?
yeah, and it seems quite stark. Like you see left-wing commentators, I'm gonna say, in like on podcasts and stuff like that, and they don't seem to grasp that very simple fact.
Yeah,
They
yeah.
just, I don't know if it's willful or whether they're totally thick.
I think it's willful.
Yeah.
Well, it's a bit of both, but I think it's willful. I think that they don't want to because it doesn't fit. And it's human nature to a certain extent. It's understandable. It's sometimes difficult to be objective, like really dispassionately objective when things challenge your own views. They're saying information which like statistical information, which directly contradicts their ideology and their worldview, and they can't or won't take it in.
And this is the thing though, like we've always talked about safety when, like, if women are traveling on their own, for example, around the world, I wouldn't dream of like going to places where it's dangerous without taking precautions, and yet they're opening the border to the very people that would protect ourselves from if we're traveling abroad. So it is concerning,
Absolutely.
especially from a women's rights perspective.
Yeah, and they are perfectly legitimate concerns. And as I say, it seems that our establishment is hell bent on not allowing those concerns to be addressed and suppressing any question about them, which is extremely worrying.
Well, yeah, because it's still happening, and it sounds to me like they're all in on it. None of them prevented those rape gangs from operating.
In
They knew it
fact,
was happening, and they let it continue, and they're still letting it continue, and nobody's being held to account, and that's reducing the trust that we have in politicians, in the police, in the establishment. The first duty is to protect the people, and they're not doing that.
yeah, no, absolutely. You could pick any of these pillars of the establishment, whether it's the judiciary, whether it's the police forces, or services as they're called now, whether it's elected politicians. You could look at what they're actually supposed to be doing, and you could very, very strongly point out, argue that they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. In some cases, they're doing directly the opposite.
I was really interested. Sorry,
No,
carry on.
I was just going to say I was agreeing with you because that erodes trust. When you have a situation like that, trust is gone. You're not going to have trust. You're not going to have trust in a judiciary that gives somebody, whether you agree with it or not, that gives somebody a longer sentence for writing a tweet than they do for sexually molesting a child. You're not going to have trust in where's the trust going to come from in a judiciary that does that? Whether it's right
No,
or wrong, whatever. Similarly, you're not going to have any trust in elected politicians that say one thing and then immediately do the opposite. You're not going to have trust in police forces that have quotas to concentrate on certain things whilst effectively decriminalising others. And you're right, so trust in our establishment has broken down, has gone, and for good reason.
Absolutely. I was just going to say about Doge. So Reform are coming in, and there's a lot of criticism of Reform, like that. Oh, they've got no experience, and I'm like, well, how do you get experience? By doing it. How does anybody get experience? And it's by doing their work. And it's a bit like, if you go for a job, unless you've got that experience, you're probably not going to get it. But you might have experience that's of slacking off and not doing a good job. But you've got experience of it. It doesn't mean you're the best person for the job. And it's similar now, isn't it?
Relying on people with experience has got us to where we are now.
And they've actually come in and said they're going to audit the council, the finances of the council, which I think is going to be interesting.
Which council is that?
I think it's Kent. They're starting with Kent.
That'll be good, yeah. That's a good thing. I mean, it really, they should welcome that. Look, if Kent is, I've got no idea about Kent County Council. I know nothing about it. If it's a well-run and transparent local authority, then it should welcome outside scrutiny, I suppose.
Yeah, I think there's always going to be waste in that sort of structure and organisation. There's going to be waste,
Definitely.
but it's something that they should be reviewing all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. Don't see any problem with that.
Yeah, so I think it'll be interesting when they've done all of them, and how the other councils who aren't going to be audited because they're not under reform, how they will respond as well, because it's going to put pressure on them to sort of do better, isn't it?
Yeah, hopefully they'll up their game. Where they can see reforms that they need to make and efficiencies that they can have, then hopefully it'll encourage everybody to be more responsible with council taxpayers' money. Because after all, that's where the money is. That's whose money it is. It isn't the council's money. It's ours.
Yeah. And the other thing I was going to say before, when you were talking about the lack of trust, I think when it comes to women and the judiciary, I think it's quite stark for women knowing that if the crime's committed, like a sexual assault or a rape is committed, the conviction rates are really low. And in some ways, that can be explained because if there's only two people there, it's one word against the other. And how do you prove either way? How do you build enough evidence, but that it's non-consensual and stuff like that? But at the same time, women do need that protection. So how do we make sure that it's a robust system? Because at the moment, well, rape's practically legal.
Yeah, it's not something I know much about, but yeah, you can imagine it's obviously a very difficult area for the reasons that you've said. And I think it would be very dangerous to be sort of pushing prosecutors and courts to be increasing convictions. I think there's valid reasons why the conviction rates are low, as you've pointed out. But at the same time, I would also say that a woman, a victim or an alleged victim of sexual crimes, alleged sexual crimes, is not going to have massive confidence in a judicial system that doesn't recognise what a woman is, for example, or that forces a woman to refer to a man as she or something like that. That is not going to help, and in fact it does. I think that is indicative of that system's attitude towards women, which is not, so you're talking about trust not being there, then yeah, there's valid reasons for trust not being there.
And I've actually seen screenshots of men who say that rape isn't really a serious crime and it shouldn't be prosecuted, and it's just I don't know, like I can't even remember what it said. It was so horrific. I just, you can see what people think now because they write it down.
Yeah, yeah.
And that isn't censored, but if you call a man, that's censored.
Yes, these are the topsy-turvy times we're living in. I think we're living in a time like, that in some ways there hasn't, the combination of things that's going on is novel. There hasn't been anything exactly like the situation that we've got now, where, as I say, we have a media-saturated world, and there's so much information out there that's created a situation that's unprecedented. We've never lived in an environment like this before. So yeah, we are seeing a lot of what a rational person would say is absurd things being pushed out by individuals, by organisations, by pressure groups, by governments, by supranational organisations like the World Health Organization and the UN and so forth, and the
Why
European
do you think
Union.
they push out so many lies, though?
Who?
Well, all the organisations you've just said, the government and the World Health Organization, and
Well, I would say those reasons, without talking about details, just my opinion, I would say those reasons, the reasons for those lies and the disinformation, to use the word that they've
I hate
coined.
that word.
Yeah, they are the purveyors of it. The reason for that is the reasons that have always been valid, which is power and money and influence.
Can you say a bit more about that? I don't know what you mean. How would it give them power and influence to tell lies?
Well, because in whose interests is it for an organisation to tell lies? You don't have to think about it much further than that. You just have to think, well, who benefits from this organisation saying X? And then you realise that there's a whole web of vested interests behind whatever's being said and whatever's being promoted. I don't know. You could pick anything, and you could argue that was the case. Pick any subject. Pick climate change. Pick the transgender ideology. Pick Russophobia. Pick anything, and it's not
What did you say?
difficult.
Russophobia?
Yeah.
Russophobia?
Yes.
What's that?
Irrational fear of Russia and Russian things.
Oh, never heard that before.
Right.
Russell, I thought you meant people who are phobic of Russell Grant or something.
Well, that might also be a condition. I've got no idea. But there's a lot of hysterical rhetoric, and any time you see that rhetoric and you think, well, I don't agree with that, or that seems wrong, or the basis for that is not clearly rationalised, then if you're like me, you start looking for reasons why. Well, why are they saying that?
Yeah.
If that doesn't make sense, that's wrong, that's a lie, why are they saying it then? And then it's not difficult to discover compelling reasons why they might be saying it. Obviously, I cannot prove any of these things necessarily. I don't have to. You can see something that seems like a pretty good rationale.
Yeah. I'm just thinking back to when because you used to listen to, was it Radio 4?
Yeah,
Like every day, but you never really got sucked into what they were saying. Like you always were quite critical of what you were hearing on the news. But
yeah,
you did, and I remember, like, when we first moved in together, you used to watch Channel 4 News as well. So you used to be quite interested in keeping up with the news, and yet you could still criticise it. But there was a point, about 5 years ago when you just went, I'm not listening to this anymore. Can you
yeah,
say a bit more about that?
yeah. Was I can remember the very day. I can't remember the date, but it was in April 2020. I had been getting increasingly annoyed at the rubbish that was being spouted from the Radio 4, the Today programme, which was something, as you rightly say, I had listened to for years. And I was increasingly aware that the stuff that they were coming out with just wasn't making any sense at all, just wasn't rational, and that I knew was just wrong. And they reached a point one day when they had somebody who was purported to be a doctor, they might have been, they might not have been, doesn't matter. This person was talking about the mass deaths from the coronavirus in amongst children in British hospitals. And that was the point where I just switched the radio off, and after that day I never switched it back on.
And what made you question what they were saying?
I didn't question it, I just knew it was wrong. Because I'm a rational person, I didn't take leave of me senses, and I just knew that it wasn't correct. It's a bit like being told Orwell's famous quote from 1984 about the party's most final and most pressing command is to ignore the evidence of your senses. Only what they say is reality. I'm very mindful of that. That was what was going on for me, and I was thinking, well, no, it was effectively like they were saying, saying that it was night outside when it was daytime.
Yeah.
It was just at that point I just thought I'm not listening to this anymore. It's just lies, and
It was
it's
like
true.
for me that quote is most, it stands out the most when I think about the boxers in the Olympics who were clearly men. I could just see from looking at them that they were men. And
Yeah,
I got asked for evidence of someone when I posted, "This is a man punching a woman in the face," and someone on Facebook had a right go at me and said, "Where's your evidence?" And I didn't even get into it with her because it was pointless. I just said, "So you never interact with me, but you're coming on here to tell me I'm wrong." And that's not very kind because she's all into kindness. But I could just see with my eyes, and I thought, well, I'm not going to provide evidence. I don't need to. I can see that that's a man.
the evidence is your eyes and ears.
Uh-huh.
Yes,
And I just
obviously.
thought, I'm not providing evidence. Like, you
But that
wouldn't
is the
believe it if I
evidence.
did.
That is the evidence. You don't
Uh-huh.
need any other evidence than that.
Uh-huh.
It's a bit like these, essentially, the people who are always shouting, "Source!" And they always want, "What's your source?" Well, oh, the BBC said it. All right, that's all right then. The Guardian said it. Oh, okay. Channel 4
Well, they're the
News said
biggest liars.
it. Yeah, I've said to you before, there isn't really any point having you can't have a rational conversation with someone who isn't rational. There is no point.
You've been saying that to me since we met.
Yeah, well, yeah, there isn't any point. There
Like,
is
how
no
should I
point.
respond to this? There's no point. They're not rational. Yeah, but I still have to deal with them, these people. Thankfully, I don't have to deal with those people anymore. But at the time, like, I did have to deal with them. It was difficult.
Of course it is. It is because you can't have a rational interaction with someone who's not rational, who's effectively taken leave of their senses, if you want to use that phrase, like you were describing before about men and in women's sports. Somebody who's saying that, what they said to you, that they have literally taken leave of their senses because it's patently obvious that the person that there was a man. It's obvious. And if they ignore their own senses and start saying, well, who says they're a man, then you can't have a rational conversation with them. There's no point.
Yeah,
It'd
well,
be like trying to talk to a cloud or a piece of furniture. No point.
well, that same man's now been found out to be lying, and the evidence has been posted all over. So, yeah,
Good. The truth will out.
they've all gone quiet. The
Yeah.
people who were saying that he wasn't a man.
They always go quiet in the end when the truth comes out. That's the thing. They just wait for the next big thing. It's the
So
same.
this, I'm just thinking about in like 2020 and 2021, that was when I started like really taking notice of the world, because that was when I realised how awful it was and how I'd been kind of not looking before. At first it was quite difficult because I was hearing a lot of things that sounded absolutely ridiculous to someone who'd been listening to mainstream media for all my life. It sounded absolutely like conspiracy theory level, um, mind-blowingly ridiculous and like out there with like the aliens have landed and stuff. And at that point, like I think at first I just went, well, I'm just gonna not dismiss it because I don't know. And then as I heard it from more and more places, and then from mainstream news as well, they started saying it as well, then it sort of became obvious that all of these conspiracy theories were actually true. How do you find how do you work out whether something's true or not when you hear it? Or because you listen to lots of different podcasts and stuff, don't you? How do you work out when you can't check the validity of something?
You can always check the validity of something, and I'm not the arbiter of truth. Everything that I think is an opinion, but some things are more obvious than others. But what I'm saying is, for anybody who wants to know things in more detail, the information is there. The information is in the public domain. One of the things that I keep saying that we live in a media saturated era. For somebody like me, that's really good because it means that the sources of information are readily available. And that enables me to effectively do my own research about things, and then compare that research to my historical parallels and contexts, and also to test that against what other people are saying and what my gut's saying ultimately as well. Because I do pride myself on me rationality, and generally, if somebody says something, I work from the starting point that it's not true, that it's not correct, rather than the other way around, which I think is that used to be the science. I'm not a scientist, but that used to be a scientific way of looking at things.
Yeah.
You start off with the assumption that, well, this hypothesis is not. Well, let's test it. See if it's true. We'll assume that it's not accurate and then test it. And I think that's the way I try and look at some of these things, and these things that get called conspiracy theories. Same. You think, well, hang on. Well, that can't be true. Let's test that, and you can do that to varying extents. And like I say, you might not be able to come up with a definitive answer. But yeah, I think you're right about the most important thing is not to simply dismiss anything immediately. Some things you can dismiss fairly quickly, like saying that boxer was a woman. You don't really have to look into that very much, because you can see that he's a man. That's like just like one little example. You can apply that process to everything. To the thing about the geoengineering that I suspect is going on in
Well,
this
it's been
country.
admitted now. They've admitted
Well,
it.
yeah, they've got something called limited. They've done something called, which the term I think is limited hangout, where they present an article saying, yeah, we might be going to do this,
They've
when
already
they're
done it, you
actually
can
already
tell.
doing it. They've been doing it for a while. I think that's what's going on with that.
Well, that was how I tested some of it, because some of it was on the government website. So people were actually sharing links to the government website with me when I was going, what? They're spraying the skies, what?
Yeah,
Like that was mind blowing to me.
the
But then I
final
was sent links to the government website and I'm like, oh, well, they're talking about it. So
and the final evidence is like you described before, the evidence of your senses. When you actually look up and you can see it being done. And even then, there's an attempt by the authorities to say, oh, well, that's just a vapour trail, that's just water vapour. Well, it isn't, because that looks completely different. It's not the same thing. That's like, I don't know, that's like seeing a shark and somebody saying, oh, yeah, that's just a big goldfish. It isn't. They're two
well,
different things.
you see like apps like noughts and crosses board, when you start off with the lines, you see that in the sky and it's like, well, how is that? How does that come about?
Yeah,
Planes don't fly like that.
yeah.
Why would they?
Yeah, so to use that topic, and the reason I brought that topic up is when I first heard about that, my first thought, my first assumption is, right, that can't be right. That's not true.
Yeah, that was
Or
mine as
it's
well.
exaggerated.
That's ridiculous.
Yes,
How
that's
how can that be
ridiculous.
right?
So then I did the process that I was just describing. I looked into it a bit more, discovered that those technologies have been around for decades. They've been the subject of scientific inquiry and discussion for years, what they entail, and then finally applying the evidence of my senses and thinking, oh yeah, actually, it's true, they are doing it.
And like I know, like when I was growing up, and you probably watched it as well, we had Tomorrow's World, didn't we? Where they showed you the science of the future, and they don't do that anymore.
I used to love Tomorrow's World as a
Do you
kid.
think it was true though back then, or do you think they were like pulling the wool over our eyes then as well?
Do I think what was true?
The things that they were talking about on Tomorrow's World.
Well, I think they were true. I think the
Do you
sort of
think they were
stuff.
selective with what they were telling us though?
Possibly, I didn't select their subject matter. What they were talking about was quite a wide range of things, but they were always presenting new technologies that could revolutionise the way we live and our lives and that type of thing. Yeah,
We should watch them back. It'd be much better than watching Top of the Pops.
I have watched some of them actually. Um, I watched a very, very good one about a car that had a navigation system. This was pre-satellite navigation. It was fantastic. It used a very, very complex combination of dead reckoning, in other words, inertial guidance, Do you know what I mean? So
No.
basically, the car would use very simple technologies to work out where it was in terms of how far it had travelled, what direction, and that type of thing. And the system married that up to Ordnance Survey maps and pre-recorded series of voice instructions for driving directions. It was unbelievably complicated, and it was demonstrated as oh, look at this fantastic system which enables me to navigate to somewhere I've never been to in a town where I've never been before. And it was, it was very interesting. That would have been, I think that was in the mid-70s when that particular episode was showcased. That's just one little example of, and I did see that fairly recently. Oh, it was quite interesting.
Yeah, really thought-provoking. Well, shall we leave it there? We've been
Yeah,
talking
I
for
think so.
over an hour now.
Okay,
So yeah, so this episode is going out tonight.
excellent.
I don't know why I said that,
How
but yeah.
exciting.
Well, thank you for coming on again. It's
Pleasure,
been an
dear.
interesting chat.
Yeah, it was a bit wild and woolly, but that's the way I like it. Right, I'll see you later on then, dear. If I get busy.
See you for dinner. Bye.